Homeless boy found a biker's child crying in a parking garage. What bikers did in return changed his life. The crying didn't echo. That was what stopped him. In a parking garage like this, 5 levels of concrete, oil-stained ramps, dead corners where sound usually bounced and multiplied. A child crying should have carried, should have climbed the pillars, should have blurred into noise. Instead, it stayed low, trapped, thin, like someone had already learned not to be loud. The boy froze halfway down the ramp, hand still wrapped around the strap of his torn backpack. He knew that sound. Not the crying, the restraint behind it, the kind you learn when making noise costs you more than silence ever did. He took one step toward it, then another, heart already beating too fast, already calculating exits, already knowing that if he turned back now, nobody would ever know what he'd left behind. And then the crying stopped. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. He waited a full 10 seconds before moving again, long enough for danger to choose its shape. The parking garage smelled like cold metal and old rain. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, some flickering, some dead entirely. It was past 9, late enough that the daytime crowd was gone, early enough that night security hadn't started doing full rounds yet. That gap, the thin slice of time where things slipped through, was when the boy usually moved. He lived in gaps. He followed the sound to the far corner of level 3, past a row of blacked-out SUVs and sedans parked too clean to belong here overnight. The crying started again, quieter now. A hiccup. A breath dragged back into control. He didn't step out right away. He watched first. A little girl sat on the concrete behind a support column, knees pulled to her chest, helmet too big for her head resting crooked beside her. Pink sneakers, one lace missing. Her jacket was zipped wrong, teeth misaligned like she'd tried to do it with shaking hands. She couldn't have been older than 5. No adults, no phone, no movement except her fingers, rubbing at a dark stain on her sleeve that looked like oil. The boy scanned the garage the way you do when you've learned not to trust scenes that look simple. Cars, shadows, ramp, elevator bay, stairwell door half open, no footsteps, no voices, abandoned then. That was worse. He stepped out slowly, making noise on purpose. His boots scraped the concrete. He kicked a pebble, let her hear him coming. The girl looked up fast, eyes wide, fear snapping sharp into focus. He stopped immediately and raised both hands. "Hey," he said, voice low, careful. I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't answer. She clutched the helmet tighter. "Did you get lost?" he asked. No response, just breathing, fast, controlled again. He crouched, keeping distance. "It's cold down here," he said instead. "Concrete pulls the heat out of you." That got her attention, a tiny nod, almost involuntary. "Where's your dad?" he asked, then immediately wished he hadn't. Her lip trembled. "He said stay by the bike," she whispered, "but I got scared." The boy's chest tightened. Bike, singular. That meant someone was coming back, or someone had already left. "How long have you been here?" he asked. She shrugged. It was still light. It wasn't light anymore. He stood and paced once, fast, mind racing. If he stayed and someone came back angry, he'd be blamed. If he left to get help, she'd be alone. If he called police, no. Not with his face, his record, his lack of anything resembling an address. He looked at the girl again, small, quiet, trying so hard not to be trouble. He made his decision the way he made most of them, by staying. "Okay," he said, taking off his hoodie despite the cold and holding it out. "We're gonna wait, together. I'll stand over there so you can see me. You can keep the helmet." "That's smart." She hesitated, then reached for the hoodie. Her fingers were freezing. He positioned himself between her and the ramp, back to the open space, eyes on the garage entrance. If someone came, they'd see him first. Minutes passed. Then tires squealed somewhere above. Then engines, plural, low, heavy, not cars, motorcycles, a lot of them. The boy felt it before he heard it fully. The vibration in the concrete, the way the air changed. He didn't turn around. He didn't move away from the girl. He just stood there, heart pounding, knowing that whatever came next would decide whether staying had been the bravest thing he'd ever done or the worst mistake of his life. He didn't turn around when the engines got closer. That was instinct, not courage. Turning your back on a child to look at danger felt like the wrong order of priorities. If something went bad, it would go through him first. That was the rule he'd just accepted without thinking it all the way through. The motorcycles rolled in from the upper levels, one by one, then in pairs, then enough that the sound stopped being countable and became a presence. Not chaos, structure. The engines weren't screaming. They were controlled, throttled low, echoing through the concrete like a warning given calmly. The girl felt it too. She pressed closer to the column, helmet clutched to her chest, eyes fixed on his face. "Are they mad?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but you stay right here. Don't move unless I tell you." She nodded. She was good at listening when it mattered. That scared him more than the bikes. Boots hit concrete behind him, not rushing, walking. Heavy steps spaced out, like whoever they belonged to didn't need to hurry to prove anything. "Easy," a voice said from somewhere behind his left shoulder. Male, calm, older. "Nobody's in trouble." The boy swallowed and slowly turned his head just enough to see without stepping away. 3 men stood 10 feet back. Leather jackets. Cuts worn soft with age. Helmets still on 2 of them, visors up. The third had his helmet hooked on his bike, and his eyes locked on the girl, not hungry, not angry. Focused. "Whose kid?" the man asked. The boy shook his head. "Found her crying. She said stay by the bike." The man exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, that tracks." More bikes settled around the level, not boxing them in, but closing exits quietly. No one reached for anything. No one shouted. It felt less like a confrontation and more like a perimeter being drawn around a mistake. The man stepped closer, hands visible. He crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over the girl. "Hey," he said gently. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then whispered it. The man nodded like he was memorizing it. "Okay, you did good staying put." He looked back at the boy then, really looked at him. Thin jacket, worn boots, backpack held together with a knotted strap. "You her dad?" he asked. The boy shook his head again. "No, I'm just here." The man studied him for a long second. "You didn't leave?" "No." "Didn't call it in?" "No." "Didn't try to move her?" "No." The man stood and turned away, speaking to someone off to the side. "She's safe. Found on 3. Kid stayed." A ripple moved through the garage, relief maybe, or something heavier. Another biker approached, older, gray in his beard, eyes sharp. He knelt in front of the girl and held out a water bottle without pushing it into her space. "Your dad's losing his mind upstairs," he said quietly. "Whole place locked down." She nodded like that made sense. The first man turned back to the boy. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated. Names stuck. Names followed you. "Evan," he said finally, not sure why. The man nodded. "I'm Mark." Mark looked at him again, then at the girl, then back. "You know what would have been easier?" Mark asked. Evan didn't answer. "Walking away," Mark said. "Most people do." Evan shrugged. She was cold. That answer landed harder than anything else he could have said. From somewhere above, a voice shouted a name. Panic, relief crashing together. Footsteps ran down the ramp. Mark raised a hand, signaling calm, and turned to Evan one last time. "You did right," he said, "and right doesn't go unnoticed around here." Evan didn't know what that meant yet. He would. The father arrived running, not riding, not calm. He came down the ramp too fast, boots slipping once on oil, helmet banging against his leg because he hadn't bothered to clip it. His face was red, eyes wild, scanning past the bikes, past the men, until they landed on the girl. There. He stopped so hard, his body rocked forward. "Oh, thank God," he said, voice cracking, and then louder. "Jesus Christ, I told you to stay put." The girl flinched. Evan felt it before he thought about it. He shifted half a step closer to her, not touching, just enough that she didn't feel alone in the open anymore. It was automatic. The same instinct that had kept him alive most of his life. Put yourself where the hit would land first. The father noticed. His eyes flicked to Evan, took him in, the backpack, the hoodie, the fact that Evan was between him and his kid. "Who the hell are you?" the man snapped. Mark stepped forward before Evan could answer, not fast, just decisive. "He's the reason your daughter isn't still crying alone behind a pillar." Mark said. You want to lower your voice. The father bristled. I don't answer to you. Mark nodded once. You do right now. The garage had gone quiet. Not silent, engines still idling, the hum of concrete and electricity, but focused. Every biker on the level was watching. No one moved closer, no one backed off. The father looked around then. Really looked. Counted bikes the way men like him always did, weighing how loud they were allowed to be. He swallowed. I was only gone a minute, he said, too fast, defensive. She panicked. Kids do that. The girl shook her head, small, violent. You said don't move, she whispered. You didn't come back. Mark held up a hand. We're not doing this here. He knelt again, eye level with the girl. You hurt anywhere? She shook her head. Just cold. Mark nodded. He stood and turned to the father. You want to take her home. That's natural. But before that happens, you're going to slow down. For what? The father demanded. This is insane. You can't just surround people. Mark didn't argue. He gestured to one of the older riders. Call it in, he said. The father's eyes widened. Call who? Her mom, Mark replied calmly. She's on the contact list. So is your brother. So is security. The father stiffened. That's not necessary. Mark's gaze sharpened. Then you won't mind it. A biker stepped away, phone already out. Evan stayed quiet. That was his skill, knowing when silence was safer than words. He watched the girl instead. The way she kept glancing at him like she needed confirmation he was still there, like if he vanished, the floor might go soft again. The father noticed that too. She doesn't know you, he snapped. She shouldn't be near you. Evan didn't flinch. Mark spoke instead. She chose him. That landed wrong. The father stepped forward. That's enough, he said, pointing at Evan. Get away from my daughter. Evan looked at the girl. She didn't move toward her father. That was when the atmosphere changed. Not aggression, gravity. Mark stepped between them fully now. You don't get to bark orders like that after losing track of your kid in a garage full of blind corners. I didn't lose her, the father shot back. She wandered. She stayed, Evan said quietly before he could stop himself. Every eye turned to him. Evan felt heat crawl up his neck. He hadn't meant to speak, but the words were already out. She stayed where you told her, he continued, voice low, steady. You didn't come back. The father stared at him like he'd just noticed Evan was human. You don't know what you're talking about. Evan shrugged. I know she was alone. Silence again. Thick now. Mark exhaled slowly. All right. Here's how this goes. We wait for the call. Then you take your daughter home. And he nodded toward Evan, walks away. The father nodded too fast. Good, Mark continued. And then tomorrow, someone from the club checks in. With you, with her. The father's jaw tightened. Absolutely not. Mark didn't raise his voice. That wasn't a request. The phone buzzed. The biker who'd stepped away looked up. Mother's on the way, 15 minutes. The father swore under his breath. The girl finally moved then, not toward her father, toward Evan. She reached out and grabbed the edge of his hoodie, fingers tight. I don't want to be alone, she whispered. Evan swallowed. Mark saw it. Every rider saw it. The father lunged forward instinctively. Not violent, just desperate, and Mark's hand came up, stopping him without touching. Easy, Mark warned. The father looked around at the wall of leather and steel and realized something important. This wasn't about him anymore. Mark crouched again, voice gentle. You won't be alone, but you're going with your mom tonight. That's happening. The girl hesitated, then nodded. She let go of Evan's hoodie. It felt heavier than holding on. As the tension bled out slowly, Mark turned back to Evan. You got somewhere to go? He asked. Evan hesitated. Yeah. It was a lie, but it was the kind people accepted. Mark studied him for a long second, then nodded. Stick around a minute after they leave. Evan didn't ask why. He already knew his life had shifted. He just didn't know how far yet. They left in layers. First the mother, arriving breathless and pale, eyes locking on her daughter like the world had narrowed to one point. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around the girl with a force that said never again, even if it was too late to mean it fully. The father stood off to the side, rigid, jaw set, saying nothing now. He'd burned through whatever authority he thought he had left. The bikes didn't watch him anymore. They watched the girl until she was safely buckled into the back seat of a car that didn't smell like concrete and oil. When the taillights disappeared up the ramp, the garage exhaled. Engines shut down one by one. Helmets came off. The shape of the place loosened like a fist unclenching. Riders talked quietly among themselves, voices low, practical. Some mounted up and rolled out without ceremony. Others lingered, checking phones, sharing looks that carried more than words. Evan stood where he'd been left, backpack strap digging into his shoulder, hands cold now that the adrenaline had drained. He didn't move. He didn't know where to move to. Mark approached alone. Up close, he looked older than Evan had thought at first. Not worn out, seasoned. The kind of man whose body remembered injuries his face didn't advertise. He stopped a few feet away and waited until Evan looked up. "You okay?" Mark asked. Evan nodded automatically, then corrected himself. Yeah. Mark accepted that for what it was. "You said you had somewhere to go," Mark said. Evan didn't answer right away. The garage felt bigger now, louder without the crying. "I've got spots," Evan said finally. "Depends." Mark nodded. "That's what I thought." He glanced over his shoulder. 2 riders were watching without pretending not to, not crowding, witnessing. "You eat tonight?" Mark asked. Evan hesitated. That question was always a trap. It came with expectations, with looks that changed when you answered wrong. "Earlier," he said. Another lie. Smaller than the last. Mark didn't press. He reached into the saddlebag on his bike and pulled out a wrapped sandwich and a bottle of water. He set them on the concrete between them instead of handing them over. "If you want it," he said. "No strings." Evan stared at the food like it might disappear if he acknowledged it too fast. He crouched slowly and picked it up, hands steady by habit even when his chest wasn't. "Thanks," he said. Mark watched him take a bite before speaking again. "You didn't have to stay." Evan chewed, swallowed. "I know. Most people don't." Evan shrugged. "She was scared." Mark smiled faintly. Not approval, recognition. "We're going to need a statement," Mark said. "Not tonight, not formal. Just later. About what you saw, what you didn't." Evan tensed. "Am I in trouble?" Mark shook his head. "No, but trouble likes to rewrite things when it gets the chance." Evan nodded slowly. He understood that kind of rewriting. "And after?" Evan asked. Mark considered him. "After you keep doing what you were doing, surviving. But maybe not alone." That landed heavier than the bikes had. Evan finished the sandwich in silence. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stood. "I should go," he said. Leaving first had always been safer. Mark didn't stop him. He just said, "If you hear from anyone about this, cops, security, anyone official, you don't answer questions alone. You call me." He handed Evan a card. No logo, no title, just a name and a number. Evan turned it over like it might bite him. "Why?" Mark met his eyes. "Because you stood where it mattered, and that makes you visible." Visible. The word sat wrong in Evan's chest. He'd spent years learning how not to be. Around them, engines started again. The garage filled with sound that rolled up the ramps and out into the night, dispersing into the city like nothing unusual had happened. Mark swung onto his bike and paused, visor still up. "Get somewhere warm," he said. "We'll be in touch." Evan nodded. As the last bikes pulled away, the garage returned to what it had been, concrete, shadows, forgotten corners. But Evan didn't go back to the dark spot behind the column. He walked out into the open, the card warm in his pocket, the echo of engines still vibrating faintly in his bones. For the first time in a long while, staying hadn't cost him everything. It had changed the math. The garage didn't empty all at once. It thinned the way fog does when the sun comes up slow, patches clearing, then filling again, as riders took different exits, different routes, none of them in a hurry. Evan stayed where he was until the last engine sound faded into the distance, until the concrete stopped vibrating under his feet. Only then did the cold really hit. He pulled the hoodie tighter around himself, the one that still smelled faintly of oil and someone else's cologne. The space felt bigger now, emptier, like it was trying to pretend nothing had happened. That was when the security lights brightened, too bright, too sudden. Evan flinched and turned just as two men in reflective vests stepped out of the stairwell. Garage security, radios clipped to their shoulders. One of them already looked annoyed, like he'd been waiting for a reason to feel justified. "You can't stay here," the taller one said. No greeting, no question, statement. Evan nodded. "I'm leaving." "Been hanging around all night?" the other asked, eyes flicking to the backpack. Evan didn't answer right away. He didn't owe them the truth, but lies had a way of sticking. "I found a kid," he said. "Her people came." The taller guard snorted. "Yeah, we saw the circus." Evan shifted his weight. "She was alone." "That's not your problem," the guard replied, "and this isn't a shelter." Evan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, that practiced shrinking, the instinct to make himself small, unmemorable. He turned toward the exit ramp, ready to walk away before things escalated the way they always did. "Hey," the second guard said suddenly, "you with those bikers?" Evan stopped. "No," he said. "I was just here." The guard studied him, then glanced at the empty garage, at the way the place still felt watched even though no one was visible. "Figures," he muttered. "Just don't make a habit of it." Evan didn't argue. He walked. Outside, the night air felt different, less trapped. The city had moved on already, traffic flowing, people laughing somewhere down the street, the ordinary cruelty of life continuing uninterrupted. He crossed 2 blocks before he realized he didn't know where he was going. That scared him more than the confrontation had. He usually had a plan, a route, a spot. Even if it was temporary, it was his. Tonight, the old places felt wrong, like going back would undo something he couldn't name yet. He stopped under a flickering streetlight and pulled the card out of his pocket. Mark. Just a name, just a number. Evan stared at it longer than he should have. He didn't like owing people. Owing always came with interest. But this didn't feel like a debt. It felt like a door left unlocked on purpose. His phone was old, cracked screen, battery that lied about how much life it had left. He powered it on and watched the percentage jump, then drop. He typed the number in. Didn't hit call. Not yet. He walked another mile before finding a diner that never closed, the kind with chipped mugs and booths repaired with duct tape. He slid into a corner seat and ordered coffee he barely tasted. The waitress didn't ask questions. That helped. As he sat there, warming up, the night replayed itself in fragments, the girl's hand on his hoodie, the way the father's voice had made her shrink, the moment Mark had said she chose him. No one had ever chosen Evan. The thought landed harder than he expected. His phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. His stomach dropped. He stared at the screen until it buzzed again, then picked it up. Mark. "You somewhere warm?" Evan swallowed and typed back. "Evan? Yeah." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Mark. "Good. Tomorrow we talk. Not about hero stuff, about options. Options." Evan leaned back in the booth and closed his eyes for a second, letting the words settle. It felt unfamiliar, heavy, like something you had to learn how to carry. He typed one last message. Evan. Okay. When he looked up, the diner window reflected a version of himself he didn't recognize right away. Shoulders less hunched, eyes still tired but steadier. Not fixed, not saved, just seen. Outside, somewhere beyond the reach of the streetlight, a motorcycle passed, engine low, unhurried. Evan didn't look up. He didn't need to anymore. Morning came without permission. Evan woke in the diner booth with his neck stiff and his phone dead on the table beside him. For half a second, panic hit, the old kind, sharp and physical, until he remembered where he was and why. The girl, the garage, the engines, the card. He sat up slowly and stretched his fingers, counting inventory the way he always did after sleeping somewhere public. Backpack still there, shoes still there, no one watching him too closely. The waitress slid a fresh mug of coffee onto the table without asking. "You look like someone who stayed up all night on purpose," she said. Evan nodded. "Something like that." She didn't push. She never did. By the time he stepped back onto the street, the city had fully reclaimed itself. Sunlight hit glass and concrete hard, flattening shadows, erasing the drama of the night before. If you hadn't been there, you wouldn't know anything had happened at all. That bothered him. He walked until his legs stopped feeling tight, then checked his phone again. Still dead. He found an outlet behind a closed storefront and waited, backpack between his knees, eyes up. When the screen finally lit, there was one message waiting. Mark, corner of 8th and Calder, noon. Eat first. Evan checked the time. He had an hour. He ate cheap and fast, eggs, toast, whatever came with calories, and showed up early anyway. Old habit. Better to wait than be waited on. Mark was already there, sitting on his bike with his helmet off, sunglasses hooked into his collar. No leather today. Plain jacket. If you didn't know what to look for, he could have been anyone. You didn't have to come, Mark said when Evan stopped a few feet away. I know, Evan replied. Mark nodded. Good. They didn't shake hands. They didn't sit right away. Mark just gestured toward a bench across the street where the sun hadn't reached yet. Tell me about you, Mark said once they were seated. Not the night, before it. Evan shrugged. There's not much. That's rarely true. Evan stared at the pavement. I move. I work when I can. I don't stay places long. Why? Because places start asking questions. Mark nodded slowly. And you don't like questions. I don't like answers, Evan said. That got a breath of a laugh out of Mark. Not mocking, understanding. Anyone looking for you? Mark asked. Evan hesitated. Not officially. Unofficially. Evan shook his head. Not anymore. Mark let that sit. You know the girl's okay, he said then. Her mom stayed the night with her. Doctors checked her out. Shaken, but fine. Evan exhaled without realizing he'd been holding it. Good. She keeps asking about you. Evan stiffened. Why? Mark looked at him. Because when she remembers that night, you're the part that didn't move. That landed heavier than praise ever could. Mark leaned back. Here's the thing, Evan. You did something right. But the world doesn't reward that automatically. Sometimes it punishes it. Evan nodded. I know. So we make sure that doesn't happen, Mark said. Not by hiding you, by anchoring you. Evan frowned. Anchoring sounds like staying. It is. Silence stretched between them, filled with traffic noise and the distant sound of a siren that wasn't for either of them. What does that mean? Evan asked finally. Mark answered carefully. It means an address, a job that pays on paper. Someone who answers the phone if your name shows up somewhere it shouldn't. Evan felt his chest tighten. I don't want to owe you. Mark met his eyes. You don't owe me. You owe the version of you that stayed last night. Evan looked away. I don't fit, he said. Mark nodded. Neither did I. That's not the disqualifier you think it is. A motorcycle passed through the intersection, slow and controlled. Another followed. Not a convoy, just movement. Mark stood. You don't have to decide anything today, but you don't walk away from this pretending it didn't happen either. Evan stood too. What if I mess it up? Mark smiled faintly. Then we correct. That's the difference. They stood there for a moment longer, two people measuring a road that didn't exist yesterday. Evan slipped the card back into his pocket, not like something fragile this time, but like a tool. Okay, he said. Mark nodded once. Good. The city moved around them, unaware. But Evan didn't feel invisible anymore. And that, more than anything else, scared him and kept him standing at the same time. The place Mark took him wasn't impressive. That was the point. It sat above a closed auto parts store on the edge of an industrial strip where the sidewalks cracked but didn't crumble. One narrow stairwell, one door with a lock that worked, a small window that looked out over a loading bay where trucks came and went on predictable schedules. Temporary, Mark said, unlocking the door, but stable. Evan stepped inside slowly, half expecting the space to reject him. He'd learned not to trust roofs that offered themselves too easily. It was clean, sparse, a mattress on a metal frame, a folding table, two chairs that didn't match, a kitchenette that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. No cameras, no alarms, no one waiting inside. Rent's covered, Mark said. Utilities, too. Paperwork's already started, but nothing moves until you say so. Evan set his backpack down without realizing it. That was new. He usually kept it on, even indoors. You don't have to stay, Mark added, but if you do, this becomes your address, which means certain things stop being optional. Evan nodded. Like what? Like being found, Mark said. Like being counted. Like being asked to show up. That sat heavy. They didn't talk about gratitude. They didn't talk about second chances. Mark walked him through the basics, how the lock worked, which neighbors minded their business, which didn't. When trash went out. Where to eat if you didn't want questions. Then he stopped at the door. One more thing, Mark said. People are going to look at you differently now. Evan frowned. Why? Because you stood still when it mattered, Mark replied. And some folks don't like mirrors. The door closed behind him. The quiet was unfamiliar. Evan sat on the edge of the mattress and listened to the building breathe. Pipes, distant traffic, a forklift somewhere below, no footsteps outside the door, no voices behind walls. He lay back fully clothed and stared at the ceiling until his eyes burned. Later that afternoon, Mark texted him an address and a time. Evan showed up early again, this time to a small shop tucked between a tire place and a welding supply store. The sign read, Logistics Support. Nothing else. Inside, a man with grease under his nails looked up and nodded once. You're Evan, he said, not a question. Evan nodded. Name's Luis. You don't need to tell me anything you don't want on paper. But if you want work, you show up when you say you will. Evan swallowed. What kind of work? Luis shrugged. Runs, inventory, cleanup, starts small, gets bigger if you don't disappear. That was fair. Evan worked until his hands ached. He liked that. Pain he could account for. At the end of the day, Luis handed him cash and a receipt. First one's always both, Luis said. Gets you used to being real. Evan folded the receipt carefully and put it in his pocket like it mattered. That night, he stood at the window of the room above the auto parts store and watched trucks come and go. Headlights, taillights, motion with purpose. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stiffened, then checked it. Girl's mom. She asks about you sometimes. Just wanted you to know she's okay. Evan stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. Evan. I'm glad. He set the phone down and didn't wait for a reply. Outside, a motorcycle passed through the intersection, engine low, familiar. Another followed a minute later, not watching, just moving. Evan lay down and slept without holding his backpack. That was the real change. Not the room, not the job, not the phone number. The fact that when the world went quiet, it didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like space. And space, he was learning, came with responsibility. The attention didn't come all at once. It arrived sideways. Evan noticed it first in the way Luis started writing his name a little more carefully on the timesheet. Then, in the way a city inspector showed up unannounced one morning, walked the shop without saying much, and left without issuing citations that usually came standard. Then, in the way Mark's messages stopped being casual check-ins and started sounding like coordinates. Don't take calls from unknown numbers. If someone asks you questions about the garage, you send them to me. Nothing's wrong. This is just how ripples move. Evan didn't like ripples. They spread without asking. 3 weeks passed. He worked, he slept, he learned how to wake up without panic, how to leave his backpack behind without feeling naked, how to show up somewhere at the same time every day and not feel trapped by it. That was when the man came to the shop. Not leather, not uniform. Button-down shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to look harmless. He stood near the entrance pretending to read a notice taped to the wall, then turned when Evan passed by with a crate. You Evan? He asked. Evan stopped. Yes, he said, because lying here would be worse. The man smiled. Name's Harold. I work with parking facilities. Luis looked up from the counter but didn't interrupt. I heard you were present during an incident a few weeks back, Harold continued. Little girl. Garage on Mercer. Evan felt the room tighten, not fear, awareness. I already gave a statement, Evan said. Harold nodded. Unofficially, this would just be clarifying. I don't answer questions alone, Evan replied, the words coming easier than he'd expected. Harold's smile thinned. We're just trying to make sure the story's consistent. Luis stepped forward then, slow and deliberate. He's working. If you've got business, you talk to counsel. Harold raised his hand slightly. No pressure. But pressure was exactly what it was. That night, Mark came by the room above the auto parts store instead of texting. He didn't sit. He leaned against the counter like someone who'd learned to stay ready. They're trying to isolate you, Mark said. Evan nodded. Figured. They want to see if you'll talk differently without witnesses. I won't, Mark studied him. You sure? Evan met his eyes. I didn't stay quiet that night to get loud now. Mark smiled then. Small. Real. Good, he said, because this is the part where people test whether you were an accident or a pattern. Evan exhaled. I didn't ask for this. No, Mark agreed, but you earned it. The next morning, Evan found a letter slipped under his door. No return address, no threats, just language, polished, careful, requesting cooperation for the sake of clarity and closure. He folded it and didn't throw it away. He brought it to Mark. That's smart, Mark said. They count on people burning things. Why? Evan asked. So later they can say you were emotional. Mark made copies. By the end of the week, a lawyer Evan didn't pay for sat across from him in a quiet office and asked him to repeat the story slowly, not to trap him, to anchor it. Consistency isn't about repetition, she said. It's about not letting them move the ground under your feet. Outside the office, 2 bikes idled at opposite ends of the block, not guarding, observing. Evan watched them through the glass and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not safety, support. That night he dreamed of the garage again, the lights, the echo, the crying. But this time, when the sound stopped, it was because someone else had arrived, not because the world had gone quiet. He woke up steady. The next phase had started, and Evan was no longer something that could be moved quietly out of the way. The hearing didn't feel like a confrontation. That bothered Evan more than if it had. It took place in a municipal building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper, the kind of place designed to soften tension through blandness. No windows in the room, neutral paint, chairs arranged so no one sat higher than anyone else, the illusion of balance. Mark wasn't in the room. That was intentional. Evan sat with the lawyer Mark had brought in and a woman from Child Services who hadn't worked the original case. That detail mattered. New eyes, less history, less defensiveness. Across from him sat 2 men and a woman he hadn't met before. One represented the parking authority, one from the city's liability office. The third introduced herself as Oversight. No one raised their voice, no one needed to. They asked Evan to walk through the night again, slowly, precisely, where he'd been sleeping, why he'd been in the garage, what time he'd heard the crying, how long before he approached, what the girl had said, what he'd said in return. Evan answered the way he'd practiced, not rehearsed but anchored. Facts, actions, sequence. I stayed, he said at one point, because she didn't know me and that was safer than her being alone. The woman from Oversight paused. Safer how? Because alone is when people disappear, Evan replied. I didn't want to be another person who walked past. No one challenged that. Instead, the questions shifted. They asked about Mark, about the bikes, about who had contacted him afterward, whether anyone had coached his statement, whether he'd been offered money. Evan shook his head. I was offered food. That landed wrong for them. He could see it. The room recalibrated. After 2 hours, the lawyer stood. That's sufficient. The Oversight woman nodded. For now. Outside, the hallway felt too long. Mark waited near the elevator, leaning against the wall like he'd been there all morning. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't need to. Evan's shoulders told him. They're not done, Evan said as they walked. No, Mark agreed, but they've stopped pretending this is about confusion. What is it about then? Mark stopped at the curb. Traffic rolled past, ordinary, indifferent. It's about control, he said. You disrupted a clean failure. Evan frowned. I didn't do anything big. That's the problem, Mark replied. You did something small and undeniable. They didn't ride together. They never did. But 2 bikes merged into traffic ahead of them anyway, spacing themselves without signal. Back at the shop, Luis pulled Evan aside. City inspector came back. Evan stiffened. Problems? Luis shook his head. No, asked questions, wrote notes, left again. That's good? Luis shrugged. It's neutral, which is better than usual. That night, Evan sat at the folding table in his room and opened the folder Mark had given him. Copies of statements, dates, names, his name, printed cleanly on the top of a page. He closed it again. The weight wasn't crushing anymore. It was grounding. His phone buzzed. Girl's mom. She started sleeping with the light off again. Evan stared at the message for a long time. Evan, Tell her she was brave. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Girl's mom. She says you were. Evan set the phone down and leaned back in the chair. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Somewhere in the city, people were deciding how much this would cost them, how far it would spread, whether it was worth resisting. And for the first time in his life, Evan wasn't something they could ignore into compliance. He went to bed knowing tomorrow would come with questions, but also knowing he wouldn't face them alone. That was the difference, and it was permanent. The pushback came quietly. No letters this time, no meetings, just friction. Small, deliberate inconveniences stacked in Evan's path like loose gravel. His hours at the shop got audited. The building inspector returned with a checklist twice as long as the last one. A bank flagged his newly opened account for review after a deposit that wasn't large enough to justify concern. Nothing illegal, nothing accidental. Evan felt it immediately. Not panic, pressure, the kind designed to make you second-guess standing still. Luis noticed too. They're testing whether you're expensive, he said one evening as they locked up. If you were alone, this would already be working. Evan didn't answer. He was learning when silence was strength, not retreat. Mark adjusted course without announcing it. Paperwork that had stalled started moving again through different offices. A phone call here, a name drop there, not threats, reminders, the kind that told people someone was paying attention without telling them who. They won't come at you head on, Mark said over coffee that had gone cold. They'll try to make normal life uncomfortable enough that you choose to disappear. Evan nodded. I won't. Mark studied him. You sure? Evan thought of the girl in the garage, of her helmet clutched too tight, of the way the world had assumed someone else was watching. Yes, he said. The first article appeared online 3 days later. No names, no photos. Just a paragraph buried under city updates about community response and unofficial assistance during a parking facility incident. It framed the outcome as orderly, procedural, inevitable. Evan read it once and closed the page. They're trying to own the ending, he said. Mark nodded. That's normal. What if people believe it? Some will, Mark said. Truth doesn't need everyone. That night, Evan walked past the garage on purpose. He didn't go inside. He didn't linger. He just crossed the street and looked at the entrance from a distance, watching cars slide in and out like nothing had ever cracked open there. A man leaned against the pay station smoking, eyes tracking Evan too closely, not threatening, curious. Evan met his gaze and didn't look away. The man looked first. At home, Evan found a note taped to his door. No envelope, just paper. You did the right thing. I wish someone had done it for me. No name. Evan folded it carefully and put it in the folder with the rest. That was when he understood what had changed. It wasn't that the pressure stopped. It was that it started to cost more than it saved. Somewhere in the city, a calculation shifted, not because of bikes, not because of noise, because one small decision had refused to be erased. Evan turned off the light and lay down, listening to the building settle. Tomorrow would bring more friction, more watching, more attempts to sand him down into something easier to manage. But the version of him that had stayed in the garage hadn't gone anywhere. And neither had the people who noticed. The shift happened on a Tuesday. Those were always the dangerous days. Too ordinary to trigger alarms, too quiet for witnesses to pay attention. Evan felt it before he could explain it, the way you feel weather change in your joints before the clouds show up. Luis called him into the office and closed the door. They offered me an inspection exemption, Luis said flatly. Evan didn't respond right away. For what? He asked. Luis leaned back in his chair. For being cooperative. For streamlining communication. For keeping things simple. Evan nodded slowly. And you said? Luis held his gaze. I asked what cooperation meant. Evan already knew the answer. They want distance, Luis continued, from you, from the incident, from anyone who complicates the story. Evan exhaled. I won't disappear. Luis nodded. Didn't think you would, but I needed to hear it out loud. That night, Mark didn't text. He showed up. He stood in the doorway of the room above the auto parts store, jacket still on, eyes sharper than usual. They're escalating sideways, Mark said. Pressure on employers, on landlords, on anyone who can be convinced to call this inconvenient. Evan leaned against the counter. So what happens now? Mark watched him carefully. Now you decide how visible you want to be. Evan frowned. I thought that wasn't a choice. It isn't, Mark said, but how you're visible is. Mark laid out the options without selling any of them. Advocacy channels, testimony, formal affidavits, public record statements that couldn't be quietly amended later. None of it dramatic, all of it permanent. They'll try to frame you, Mark said, not as a liar, as unreliable, as someone with too many variables. Evan nodded. Homeless, no record, no address until recently. Exactly. Evan looked at the folder on the table, the notes, the copies, the receipt from his first day's work. What happens if I step forward? He asked. Mark didn't soften it. You lose the option of slipping back into the cracks, forever. Evan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was steady. I already lost that. The meeting happened 2 days later. Not a hearing, not court. A sworn statement recorded with oversight, present and counsel on both sides. Evan wore clean clothes that still felt wrong on him, sat upright in a chair that didn't wobble, and told the story again. No drama, no embellishment. He described the sound of crying that didn't echo. The way the girl had tried not to be loud, the choice to stay. When asked why he hadn't called police immediately, Evan answered honestly. I didn't trust that she'd be the priority, he said. I trusted that she wouldn't survive being alone. The room went still. Afterward, no one congratulated him. No one thanked him. The people involved simply recalculated and moved on to the next problem. Outside, Mark waited by his bike. You just became expensive, Mark said. Evan nodded. Good. That night, the letter came. Certified, official, carefully worded. It informed Evan that certain matters were now under review and that he might be contacted again. He folded it once and placed it in the folder. Later, his phone buzzed. Girl's mom. She asked if you'd ever visit. Evan stared at the message for a long time. Evan, not yet, but tell her I'm proud of her. He set the phone down and looked out the window at the loading bay below. Trucks came and went, drivers doing their jobs without knowing anything about the lines that had shifted beneath them. Evan didn't feel brave. He felt committed. And commitment, he was learning, was heavier than fear, but it didn't bend the same way. Whatever came next, it wouldn't happen quietly. Not anymore. The city never announced the conclusion. It simply moved past the moment where it could pretend nothing had happened. The review closed without spectacle. No press conference, no apology. Just a memo that adjusted language, reassigned responsibility, and quietly recommended procedural changes. Names weren't highlighted, failures weren't admitted, but the outcome stuck, the kind that couldn't be walked back without effort. Evan read the notice once and set it down. He was sitting at the folding table in the room above the auto parts store, sunlight cutting across the floor in a way that still surprised him. He'd learned the sound of this place now. The trucks in the morning, the radio downstairs, the door that stuck unless you lifted it just right. Normal sounds. Mark stopped by that afternoon without calling ahead. He didn't sit. He leaned in the doorway like someone checking on a site after a storm. It's done, Mark said. Evan nodded. I figured. They won't bother you anymore, Mark continued, not because they learned, because you're not worth the risk now. Evan thought about that. That's supposed to feel good? Mark smiled faintly. It's supposed to feel finished. They stood there in silence for a moment. You don't owe us anything, Mark said. This doesn't turn into a story where you wear a jacket or ride a bike or belong to something you didn't choose. I know, Evan replied. But, Mark added, you're welcome around. That part doesn't expire. Evan nodded again. He'd learned the difference. Later that week, Evan walked into the garage one last time, not to check it, not to confront it, just to pass through in daylight, when the echoes were smaller and the shadows behaved. Cars came and went. A family argued about a ticket at the pay station. Someone laughed. No crying. He didn't stay long. That night, his phone buzzed. Girl's mom. She wants to say thank you herself. No pressure. Evan stared at the message, then typed back. Evan, Tell her she doesn't have to. I'm glad she's okay. A pause. Girl's mom. She said you stayed. That matters to her. Evan looked out the window at the street below. A motorcycle passed through the intersection, engine low, unremarkable. Another followed a few minutes later. No formation, no signal, just motion. He didn't chase it. The next morning, Evan went to work. He signed his name on the sheet. He stacked inventory. He took a lunch break at the same time as everyone else. His name was on paper now, not as a problem, not as a footnote, just as someone who showed up. That was the change, not rescue, not reward. Not transformation, continuity. The world hadn't become kinder. It had become slightly more careful, slightly more accountable, enough to make staying a viable option. Evan locked the shop that evening and walked home without checking over his shoulder. The key fit the lock because it was supposed to. He stood inside the room, lights on, door closed, and let the quiet exist without filling it. Some people ride past, some people look away, and sometimes someone stops, not because they're strong or brave or meant for it, but because leaving would cost more than staying. That was all Evan had done, and it had been enough to change the shape of his life. Quietly, for good.